Many men and women of violence have been romanticized by people of later eras. Driven by pieces of popular culture, such as the Assassin's Creed games, the popular conception of an assassin has turned from that of a ruthless murderer to that of a renegade anti-hero, killing only because it's for the greater good. The foundations of this viewpoint lay within the historical Islamic realm, which would come to be known as the Nizari Ismaili state. Welcome to our video on how the Nizari became the most feared assassins of their era and how they eventually met their end. We live in the information age, which means that the protection of our personal data and information is of the utmost importance. The sponsor of this video, Dashlane, is the best protection you can have in this new world. Dashlane is a cross-platform premium password manager and digital wallet application, and its mobile and desktop app gives you a shortcut for everything you do online. It works on every device and OS, allowing the user to fill forms fast with one-click logins and autofill for personal info and payment details. If there's any attempt to hack your account, Dashlane responds with personalized security alerts. Unlike other solutions, Dashlane never accesses your personal data, won't trick you into subscribing, never sees your data, and is always ad-free. So, what are you waiting for? Try it on your first device by heading to dashlane.com/kings and get 25% off premium with the code KINGS. Almost simultaneously with Islam's meteoric rise to superpower status in the 7th century, internal division permanently split the new faith into two opposing parties. These were the Sunni, Muslims who believed that Abu Bakr's succession of Muhammad in 632 was correct, and the Shia, who considered the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law Ali the legitimate heir, or Imam. After a series of civil wars, Umayyad leader Muawiyah took the caliphate from the heirs of Ali, and this subsequent struggle against central power defined the Shia and prompted the breakaway of many subgroups with diverging viewpoints. In time, the Umayyads were defeated by the Abbasids in another civil war. The age of Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur was the catalyst for one of these new sects, the Ismaili. At some point in his reign, the 6th Shia Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, declared his radical eldest son, Ismail, to be his divinely inspired successor, a doctrine known as Nas. However, his plans were derailed in 762, when Ismail unexpectedly died at the age of 40, raising hard questions on who the next Imam should be. When Jafar also passed away a few years later, 6 groups disputed who the next Imam ought to be. 2 of these groups became the first Ismaili Shia by asserting the legitimacy of Ismail despite his death and supporting his descendants. In contrast, those who accepted Ismail's younger brother Musa's imamate eventually became known as the Twelvers, the Shia denomination championed by the Iranian states from the Safavids to the modern Islamic Republic of Iran. The Ismailia disappear from history until around the mid-9th century, when their leaders burst onto the historical stage and spread the movement to regions across the faltering Abbasid Caliphate, from the Maghreb to Khorasan. The movement managed to tear away vital pieces of the once unified caliphate. An Ismaili revolt in Arabia led to the creation of a religious utopian republic in modern Bahrain under the Kamatian dynasty, whose slaveholding society was otherwise unusually egalitarian and communal for the age. However, the crowning achievement of this sectarian revolution was the establishment of Al-Mahdi Billah's Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa. Although the Fatimids only occupied a relatively small and peripheral area at first, they managed to hugely increase their power in 969 by conquering Egypt. Bolstered by that, the Fatimids entered what historian Farad Daftari dubbed the Ismaili century. In the 100 years following Egypt's fall to the Shia, rich and diverse Ismaili literature flourished in the many new libraries, blended with other traditions, and resulted in incredibly complex systems of thought. The Fatimids developed complex administrative and financial structures, in addition to re-establishing far-flung trade routes to India. Along with the accompanying riches and exotic goods, this exchange also spread Ismaili teachings to Gujarat. However, beginning in the second half of the 11th century, the Fatimid star began to fade, as the Shia Caliphate was faced with internal and external problems. a dynastic crisis shattered Ismaili unity forever in December 1094, when Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir passed away. After a 58-year-long reign, it was widely expected that his well-prepared 50-year-old son, Abu Mansur Nizar, would inherit the throne in Cairo. But the powerful vizier, Al-Afdal, effectively controlled the government and wanted to retain personal power. Upon al-Mustansir's death, Al-Afdal organized a palace coup, placing Nizar's inexperienced 20-year-old brother, al-Mustali, on the throne, knowing that he could control the latter. This usurpation succeeded due to the support of the Caliphate's armies, as well as religious and court notables who were in thrall to Al-Afdal, but Nizar wasn't going to take it. He fled to Alexandria, where he was proclaimed caliph by a Turkic governor. The population also supported him, and it seemed as though Nizar's revolt would be a success. A Nizarist army repelled an attack by the vizier's troops and even advanced close to Cairo. However, Al-Afdal marshaled his superior resources and besieged Alexandria, leading to Nizar's surrender in 1095. Soon, the rightful Fatimid ruler had been imprisoned and executed by amirament. Most of the Ismaili religious communities in Egypt and Syria eventually came to terms with the succession. Persian and other adherents in the Muslim East refused, continuing to support the martyred prince's house and becoming the independent Nizari. One prominent figure of the Nizari Ismaili would spearhead their movement and found what would become known as the Hashashins order, Hassani Saba. Although he was born in a Twelver family in Qom, Iran at some point around 1050, Hassan had been educated in nearby Ray. After initially believing the Ismaili doctrine to be heretical, he came into contact with a prominent local Ismaili missionary at 17 and was convinced of the sect's legitimacy. To prove his newfound devotion genuine, Hassan swore allegiance to al-Mustansir in faraway Cairo. He then travelled to Egypt in 1078 and stayed there for 3 years. During his time in Fatimid lands, Hassan always favoured Nizar's faction and acted against the vizier, at the time Al-Afdal's father, a fact which eventually saw him banished in early 1081. Having been thus expelled, he returned to Isfahan. By this time, the once majestic Abbasid Caliphate had been all but subsumed by the all-conquering Seljuk Turks. These new invaders established a Sunni military empire which stretched from Khorasan to Anatolia, ruthlessly persecuting Ismaili heretics as they did so. In opposition to his new Seljuk overlords, Hassan travelled their empire as a missionary for 9 years, gauging their military strength and formulating a strategy of resistance. In 1087, the Ismaili firebrand started dispatching other missionaries into the vicinity of a remote and nigh invulnerable mountain fortress known as Alamut, located in the area just south of the Caspian Sea, to Ismailize its population. He withstood numerous Seljuk attempts to stop his underground activity and managed to remain in hiding. In late 1090, Hassan moved via mountainous routes, finally slipping into Alamut unnoticed. He lived under the radar as a religious tutor known as Dikada for several months, instructing the children of Alamut's garrison and slowly turning prominent figures to his side. Eventually, the castle's governor realized the infiltration, but it was too late. He had been slowly surrounded by a garrison and population who supported Hassan. Incapable of defending himself, the governor left the castle. Alamut's capture was the beginning of what would become known as the Nizari Ismaili state, and the beginning of a new phase in the Ismailis' relations with the Turkic sultans whom they vehemently opposed. What had previously been a clandestine, secret society-like movement became an open revolt aimed at the very heart of the Seljuk state, driven by a mix of sectarian and Iranian ethnic motivation. Sultan Malik Shah I and Vizier Nizam al-Mulk were keen to extinguish this budding heresy, and launched several attacks against Alamut, but the castle held out against overwhelming military strength. On the contrary, the Nizaris acquired a second enclave of territory in Kuhistan after dispatching missionaries to that area. They got a break from the attacks in late 1092, when both the Sultan and his anti-Ismaili vizier died. It is possible that Nizam al-Mulk was the very first victim of the Nizari assassins, although the evidence is tenuous. Regardless, the loss of these two plunged the Seljuk Empire into civil war, essentially fragmenting it into a mosaic of squabbling fiefs, ruled by religious and military leaders. Hasan consolidated his position and expanded Ismaili influence, acquiring other formidable strongholds in the Elburz Mountains, among them Girdka and Lamisar. Rather than being one contiguous state, the various citadels of Hasan's fortress network were almost always surrounded by potentially hostile territory. Therefore, the disunited Ismaili mountain cities acted both as an impenetrable defensive bastion and as a base of operations for religious and military activity. These Eastern Ismaili supposedly received congratulations and a message of goodwill from Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir, but after his death and the Great Ismaili Schism, Hasan cut all ties with Egypt. Although the Seljuk Empire's post-Malik Shah weakness removed the immediate threat to Hasan's Ismaili realm, the decentralization also made his ultimate goal, the total overthrow of the Seljuks, almost impossible. There was no longer a single figure who could be defeated in battle and cast from the throne. In effect, there was now no central target, but a whole gallery of petty kings. Surrounded by more powerful adversaries and seeking a new method of achieving their aims in lieu of an army, Hasan's Nizari began to utilize another strategy that had been used by Shia groups for centuries: assassination. Although political murder was and is a universal method of warfare, the Nizari granted it an increasingly central role in their political strategy, knowing how effective it could be. This part of Nizari history has been distorted by groups who were hostile to or unfamiliar with them and their practices. For example, rumors circulated by later Latin sources threw the term Hashashin around to designate them, due to the probable fiction of hashish use as inspiration for the assassins. That being said, there does seem to have been what might be called a cult of assassination in Alamut and other fortresses. Nizari assassins were known as Fidai, literally those willing to sacrifice, and were revered for their bravery and courage. This was largely because such missions were considered suicidal. Nizari leaders dispatched their Fidai, who became increasingly professional, primarily to dispatch targets who were a known threat to the Nizari state. This included Seljuk viziers, local emirs, and prominent rulers. The Nizaris also managed to expand their influence into Syria around the time of the First Crusade, capturing a few fortresses and intermingling politically with Seljuk principalities and the Christian Crusader states. In Persia, Muhammad Tapa took command of the Turkic Empire in 1105 and immediately launched a series of campaigns against all of the Nizari territories south of the Caspian Sea. His main stroke fell on Shadiz in 1107, which fell relatively quickly after a Fidai failed to slay one of the Sultan's viziers. For over a decade, Seljuk campaigns against the Nizari continued unabated, resulting in constant massacres and persecution of those Ismaili who could not escape to the castles. Many Nizari fortresses fell under the assault, but finally, when the Seljuks were on the verge of taking Alamut in April 1118, Muhammad Tapa died and the pressure waned. This was the beginning of a new phase in Nizari-Seljuk relations, one of a stalemate due to exhaustion. Scores of Ismailis had been slain in the cities, damaging their support base. Hasan's 3-decade-long anti-Seljuk revolt, in which a state with no real army had survived, inflicting damage on a giant military empire, had failed, but the Nizari state was still a cohesive one. From that point, the focus would turn to defense and consolidation, the transformation of the Nizari state into a permanent one. Hasan's attention turned to scholarly pursuits and peaceful relations, though the latter was often achieved by illicit means. For example, Hasan received reports that a Seljuk ruler named Ahmad Sanjar was planning a campaign against him. Allegedly, that man woke up one day to find a dagger thrust into the bed next to him, accompanied by a note stating that Hassani Saba would like peace. Shocked and no doubt slightly terrified, he gave the Nizaris no further trouble, even promoting a relatively tolerant attitude and granting them 4,000 dinars per year as a pension. The threat of assassination clearly worked as well as the deed itself, at least for as long as Hassan was alive. However, the Nizari leader fell ill in 1124 and designated his successor, appointing a council of advisors to guide him in the role. In the same year, he passed away inside Alamut at the age of 70, having never left the citadel for 34 years. An effective stalemate continued for decades following his death. Often the Nizari in Persia or Syria would take a fortress only to have another one taken from them. There were periods of peace as well as those of intermittent warfare. Throughout all of it, the strongholds of Hassan's movement remained cohesive and organized. In 1162, a man named Rashid al-Din Sinan was sent from Persia to lead the Syrian branch of Nizari, who had grown in influence in the half-century since first penetrating into the region. Despite being far removed from one another territorially, the various Nizari enclaves all took their orders from the central leadership in Alamut. This appointee would later become known as the Old Man of the Mountain in the tales of European explorer Marco Polo. Sinan immediately delved into the ever-shifting interfaith web of political alliances in Syria, eventually sending Fidais to assassinate an up-and-coming Muslim leader who sought to unify the region, Saladin. The Nizari killers failed twice, once after invading the Ayyubid ruler's military encampment, and once during his siege of Azaz. Sinan's headquarters at Masyaf was besieged in response, but it did not fall, and a compromise was eventually reached between the two great men. One of the most notorious assassinations of Sinan's rule occurred during the closing stages of the Third Crusade. A rivalry had existed between Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionheart since the venture's early stages, which prompted both men to support different candidates for the crown of Jerusalem. Much to King Richard's anger, the highly competent Conrad of Montferrat was unanimously elected to the throne of Jerusalem. However, the prospective monarch would never be crowned. At noon on April 28, 1192, the Frankish Crusader lord was returning from having lunch with his friend, the Bishop of Beauvais, accompanied by a few guards. On his walk, Conrad was approached by two Christian monks whom he had become familiar with recently. A conversation began between the two groups, putting Conrad's guards at ease with the seemingly innocuous men. At that moment of greatest vulnerability, they suddenly sprang forward with daggers, brutally stabbing the king-elect with at least 2 blows to the side and back. Although the assassins, who were Fidai dispatched by Rashid al-Din Sinan, were either killed or captured, Conrad either died instantly from his wounds or soon after being taken to a nearby church. Various motivations and culprits have been designated for the murder. Richard the Lionheart was accused because of his enmity towards Conrad, while a letter to Austria's Leopold V detailed Conrad's murder of a shipwrecked Nizari crew in Tyre as the cause of his death. Whatever the case, this killing only furthered the mythical European vision of mysterious assassins who did not fear death. These later decades of the 12th century marked a high point of the Syrian Nizaris in particular, a period that came to an end when Rashid al-Din Sinan died at Masyaf in 1193. The 13th century was dawning, and it would be the equivalent of an apocalypse for the Ismailis. At the beginning of the 13th century, the Mongol juggernaut rolled through the Islamic world, crushing all in its path. The Khans became famous for their utilization of talented native peoples from the lands they conquered, and this apparently included a number of Sunni courtiers who despised the Ismaili. They must have known of the Nizaris' reputation for defiance, in addition to their penchant for assassination. Perhaps after adding a few more fanciful details, these tales must have greatly concerned the Khan, who viewed them as a risk. After initial lukewarm relations, Muhammad III of Alamut received a dreadful shock in 1246. Upon the ascension of Ogedai's successor Guyuk, many Muslim leaders sent embassies of congratulations and gifts to the great Khan. Out of them, only the Nizari ambassadors were harshly dismissed. To back up this hostile stance, the Khan proclaimed that of every 10 reinforcements he would send to Persia, 2 must be used to reduce rebellious lands, prominently those of the Ismaili. This was a policy that Guyuk's successor, Mongke, who desired complete and total domination of Western Asia, mimicked. Despite offering ferocious resistance, the Mongol pressure was simply too great. On November 19, 1256, the final Nizari Imam, Kersha, surrendered Alamut to Hugulu and was initially shown mercy. After being escorted from his lands, however, he was unceremoniously killed in the Khangai Mountains. Back in Persia, the walls of captured Nizari fortresses were torn down, vast libraries of knowledge were torched and thousands of civilians slaughtered. One by one, the mountain strongholds fell, with their fidais putting up a desperate fight. The final Ismaili castle of Gurdka fell on December 15, 1270. The violent destruction of Hassani Saba's Alamut-based state put an end to Nizari statehood forever. Against all the odds, the Nizari did survive into the modern day, and are currently led by their 49th Imam, Aga Khan IV, from the Portuguese capital of Lisbon, with an estimated 15 million followers in more than 25 countries. Although these Nizaris are far less militant, the story of self-sacrificing predecessors continues to shine brightly in their memories. We always have more stories to tell, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible.